What is the purpose of ta'lim, tarbiyah in our tradition? Obedience to God and seeking the pleasure of God.
The Islamic education produced generations of thinkers, jurists, scientists, ulama, reformers.
The role model is, of course, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam.
Yeah.
He embodied all the forms of perfection.
This Islamic educational system has lost its vitality. What went wrong? How can Islamic education be restored to its rightful place as a source of guidance and renewal for the Ummah? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Joining us here with Dialogue Within Islam on the topic of Islam and Islamic education. I'm your host, Saf Chowdhury. I'm the Academic Director at the Centre for Islamic Knowledge in Toronto, at CIK in Toronto. I'm also a lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College. My own research specialization is in Tasawwuf, in Sufism, Islamic law, philosophy and theology. And I also have a keen interest in Islamic education, having recently published an article and some more in the pipeline. Dr. Maulana Harun Sidat is a well-known scholar of Islam, and he has wide range of interests. For anyone who knows him and follows his work, whether that's Islamic theology, law, Sufism, the social sciences, education. So he's really, really, engaged in a number of fields. He completed his Alimiyya at Jami'atul Ilm al-Huda. He specialized in economics and finance. He did his postgraduate work at Cardiff University, where he has been since, I think, 2014, 2015. Correct me if I'm wrong, Manaharan.
Yeah.
He's been under a scholarship for his postgraduate studies. He did his PhD on the Darul Ulooms in modern Britain, and it's going to be a changer when it comes out, inshallah, finally as a monograph, a full, complete monograph. He's been involved in many, many projects that are both academic and community-led. And many, many people, know him in his hard work that he does at grassroots work and at the academic level. So he's a reformer there, on the ground, as well as, in the academic sort of enterprise. He's published papers that explore, the relationship and interaction between Islamic law, history, ethics, and of course, this is the issue today, contemporary concerns of Muslims living in the West. So his output is prodigious, and I urge you all to follow his work, if you're not already doing it, and inshallah you find it of immense benefit. And with that, I really want to welcome Maulana Harun to Dialogue Within Islam today. Ahlan wa sahlan, Maulana.
Thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be part of this conversation, important conversation. And I want to thank you and the organizers for making this happen. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
We're continuing this topic of Islamic education. DW Islam, has given a number of installments, a number of sort of discussion for this topic. We had a symposium, a seminar in London earlier in the year, and we're continuing the conversations online and in person as well. So when we talk about Islamic education today, we're not just referring to schools or madrasas. We're really talking about Islamic education more broadly in terms of the intellectual and moral engine of the Islamic civilization. Now, historically, the Islamic education produced generations of thinkers, jurists, scientists, ulama, reformers, thought leaders, innovators, not innovators in terms of bid'ah, but innovators in terms of technological innovators. And really changed not just how Islamic metropolises and societies and cultures lived and flourished, but outside in humanity in general. But many now argue that this system, this Islamic educational system, has lost its vitality. It doesn't seem to, the argument is, it doesn't seem to generate, new ideas, or it doesn't seem to allow an engagement creatively with the modern world. So the question before us in our discussion today, then, is what went wrong, and how can it be restored? How can Islamic education be restored to its rightful place as a source of guidance and renewal for the Ummah? What do you think has led to the current state of Islamic education being diagnosed as this kind of ailing system that many argue that it's no longer generative or innovative? I mean, what's your initial thoughts about that
Thank you very
question?
much. It's a big question. So one way we can
Mm,
start with this is probably a neat thread that might run through our discussion is
yeah,
what is the purpose of ta'lim, tarbiyah in our tradition in Islam?
yeah,
And you might get varying answers, but I think they'll all come around this idea of obedience to God and seeking the pleasure of God. Um, so that's what the Quran and Hadith talk about. How it works in practice is, of course, open to conversation. The role model is, of course, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam.
that's also that.
And the Prophet, of course, when we look at his life,
Yeah,
he embodied all the forms of perfection that we now have. So whether it's being a father, a husband, a military leader, an imam, a judge, a qadi, he embodied all forms of perfection.
mm,
What happened on the back of that is as Islamic civilization grew, we move through time. These roles, because they can't be found in one person, we then demarcated them, if you like, into different sciences or different positions. So you have, the office of the judge, you have the fuqaha, you have the muhaddithin, you have the generals, you have the imams who lead the prayers. Everyone has their own role, and you have different sciences like the fiqh, which is one science among many. And you can also think about this in terms of space. So in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the masjid would have
so,
been the center for everything. Literally,
mm,
everything would have taken place in there. Religious and no, so-called non-religious activities, political in nature, social in nature, would have taken place in the house or the mosque of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But of course, over time, these were then, for practical reasons, we can say, were demarcated. So then you have different spaces. You have a political space, a religious space, madrasas, makatib, but you also have judges, courtrooms. So you have these spaces that then evolve over time. There's a separate conversation about how we think
yeah,
about that today in secular or living as minorities, secular spaces or living as minorities. But I think when we look at what we're thinking about Islamic education is about coming closer to God. How do we do
yeah,
that in practice? Then we have institutions that do that. And one of the things that made us really, really productive, if you like, successful was what we never saw the sciences themselves, lidatihi, problematic. So whether that was philosophy, whether that was mantiq, I mean, these sciences came later on anyway, and they went through a very colored history. Or kalam,
when you mean sciences, you mean like the natural
the
sciences,
natural
like the
sciences, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
We never really had, I mean, you see this in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ engaged
yeah.
with the world. I mean, even in I was talking to some students just a few days ago, and I was telling them that even if you think about the first revelation, uh, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. God
Mm,
says, read in the name of the Lord of your Lord who created. خلق الإنسان من علق. So it's not a theological claim here. It's basically a natural science claim, if you like. It's Allah saying, the one who created insan from alaq, this clinging fluid. So it's like observable. So we start from observing what's happening around us,
mm,
what brings us together. So we already see this idea very early on, even in Revelation, interestingly. In Revelation and natural sciences are sort of coming together, if you like. So I think the challenge has been that there have been a number of challenges. One of them is structural. So of course, the destruction of the Muslim world, if you like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and colonization, those sort of factors have played a huge role. We know that historically speaking, for example, in Hindustan, many, many ways you can approach it. The deliberate dismantling of the madrasa system, the upending of the systems in terms of language. So languages being replaced in other parts of the Arab world, for example. These sort of things are very, very clear. I also think that one of the challenges that when we think about paradigms, knowledge systems,
Yeah,
whether you call it secular systems,
yeah,
they've been sort of put right at the top, and you have a double back problem because some Muslims see secular as completely like we can't touch it, we can't go near it. So you have this idea like you have this dini dunyawi binary, which often emerges in Muslim discourse, where deen is sort of the religious space, and then the dunyawi sciences are sort of, we shouldn't be touching them, which is very, very interesting. I mean, Imam Ghazali, when we read his Kitab al-Ilm, in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he's absolutely quite clear. I mean, he talks about different types of knowledges, right? Mahmud,
yeah.
Mazmoom. But he also has an interesting passage where he says, you actually need the dunya for the deen. In other words, he calls it a dunya mazra'atul akhirah. So you need the dunya to not only because at an individual level you need to basically be able to prepare for the afterlife, but if people's dunya is not safe, not stable, if we're living under oppressive regimes, poverty, war, for example, then people don't really have time for religion. They don't have the luxury to focus on religious practice. So actually, this dini dunyawi binary is quite damaging to the Muslim worldview. And of course, as a result of that, we also become very reactionary. So if you follow most social media actors, not all we talk about are problems, all we talk about are issues, but
Hmm.
very few of us actually think about or give as much airtime to the solutions. When I watch people talk about this is problem or that's problem or this is haram or whatever,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm always interested in, okay, so what have you got to say about it? What's the
definitely.
solution to it, right? So it's easy saying modernity and post-modernity is bad. Okay, so how do we live? Capitalism. We live in capitalism. We breathe capitalism. What's the solution? What do we do with it? Do we reject it completely, which is kind of very problematic, or do we kind of think about critiquing it, but thinking about how we can make the world a better place? So I think structurally we had colonialism, we had these sort of issues that have come. We've also had philosophical challenges that have come in. We've also had I mean, it's never tied separate from finance. Awqaf were dismantled. I know in the UK now, alhamdulillah, there are now organizations, people are seriously taking into consideration endowments to kind of support madrasa students. So I think those are some of the issues that have led us to our current situation, and we're really imitating. We're not a tahqiq culture, illa mashallah. We're not doing innovative research. We're not able to produce people who are. We're kind of talking in our own little bubble, and we're not engaging with the world, what's happening out there. I mean, you're mashallah very familiar with the field that you're in, but I mean most people are not aware with what's happening in physics, in mathematics, let alone AI. And so we have to really engage with these sciences, and sometimes it's useful to get people who are not necessarily from madrasa situations, but who have a hard science background. I was talking to a colleague of ours about this. Sometimes people who have a science background, they might be the ideal person or people to get into madrasa and to teach because they have the scientific background. They all know what's happening in real time, and they can bring that into conversation with the nusus in the Quran and Hadith and fiqh behind me. So what we really need to do is think about not breaking, but bringing together into a synthesis. So we have what I would call an epistemicide. We've separated all the sciences, and we can't see them anymore as a coherent whole because we no longer teach metaphysics, we no longer do ilahiyat, we don't really do kalam, we don't really do theology. We're still kind of thinking the world's some 6th century, 8th century, 10th century place. It's kind of, we really need to think about how we can prepare our youth, our children, our madrasa graduates for the real world out there.
Would want a couple of things I want to add to definitely your diagnosis is there was, of course, the decline of Islamic education in general being traced back to the collapse of the Ottoman Khilafah, because here you had obviously a unified political intellectual infrastructure that once upheld Islam as a kind of, on a civilizational level, that collapse inevitably is going to have repercussions on the way the educational infrastructure will be. So I think the collapse of Muslim territorial political unity had that effect. You also mentioned about the binary, this kind of secular, sacred, religious, worldly binary, and that rupture came with, of course, colonial modernity, where we separated knowledge, into this kind of dualism of religious and worldly. And that persists today, where people think they're two separate tracks. And as you mentioned, that shouldn't be how a Muslim looks at
Yeah.
these sciences. And you quoted Imam Ghazali. Another thing I guess I'll add, and I want to get your thoughts on it before we kind of move to, maybe looking at some more deeper impacts and then looking at the solutions going forward. I mean, over time, in Islamic education system. You are, of course, a product of the traditional madrasa system. So let me know how you want to speak to this as well, myself included. I mean, rote memorization, the claim is this, that rote
Mhm.
memorization, this kind of hifz of mutun and material, replaced critical reflection and critical, nurturing a sort of independence of thought. And once you do that, once you just replace learning as being a preservation exercise and and an uncritical transmission exercise, you stifle kind of generative thinking, the thinking that is required to produce new ijtihad or to look for innovation in technology and industry and science, to look for new creative modes of solving problems, things like that. So I don't know what you think about that particular, because I know we're still on the kind of diagnosis
Yeah,
part.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know what you think about that idea about did rote memorization kind of puncture our tires a bit over the generations?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to, I don't think it's HIVS itself.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's a number of factors. But to speak to HIVS, I mean, memorization is not unique to Islamic tradition.
yes,
Other
yes.
cultures, there are books that are written on this, where memorization was celebrated. And it's important to just acknowledge that. So it's not unique to Islamic civilization. I think what's happened is memorization is a stage uh, on a journey to acquiring knowledge. It's not the end goal. And in our culture, in certain places, at least in the UK, people almost glorify memorization or hifz of the Quran to the extent that that's all they do. But nobody really understands what Revelation says. So there's a danger that we memorize the Quran just so we can get our children to become trophy children, so we can tell people that they memorized the Quran. When you
Mm,
ask the child, what have you memorized? What does Revelation actually say?
mm,
Or what plans do you have to study further? They don't have any plans, or the parents don't have any plans to study further. So that's an important point. I think we need to speak to people and say, well, it's good that your child has memorized Quran, or you want them to. Why haven't you thought about them understanding Revelation? I mean, what a sorrowful state to be in, that you meet God on the day of judgment, saying, "Oh, I've memorized your words, God, but I don't know what you're saying. I don't know what you're saying." I mean, you've memorized it, but you have, and worse still, you could say, is that you haven't embodied the Quran. Like you've memorized the Quran, but you don't live the Quran. كان خلقه القرآن, as Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha would say when she was asked how the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was like. Um,
yes.
like like Rudolf Ware in his book, right? He
Mm,
talks about the idea, he talks about Senegambia, but there's this idea of the Quran is meant to flow in your veins, literally, like you're supposed to embody the Quran. So Hifz is only a stage or memorization, not just the Quran, it could be a mutun text that we all memorized when we were students. We memorized them. But they were just an aid to actually then going into deeper into the text. So the memorization is like the entry point. And you've memorized this mutun, whether it's the Hidayah, whether it's the Quduri, whatever it may be. And then you've got to take the student to another level, which is that, okay, what are the evidences for what we just memorized? And then you got to go on to other levels of, okay, what are the jadali ways of understanding? What are the debates? How do we understand these masail? And then you can get into comparative fiqh. So memorization is not what we need in of itself. What we need is people to actually think deeply. And I think that's a form of memory. When there's an argument to be made that when you think deeply about masail or
Mm.
ayat, that's a form of memorization because it's within you now. You're deeply thinking about it. So there is a challenge in popular Muslim culture. We have to be honest. I don't know if down south if that's the case, but there is a
Mm.
challenge where people overemphasize memorization of Quran while neglecting, while actually it's just a stage um, in actually understanding revelation. And there can be liturgical purposes. So, for example, when you're delivering khutbah or you're delivering
Yeah.
a bayan or lecture, you can immediately recall verses and hadith. But that's also useful if you understand what you're saying. So sometimes people will repeat hadith and Quran ayat, but it actually doesn't mean what they think it means. So it goes to the point that you've memorized it, but have you actually understood it? Because you've got to put the ayat, the hadith, or whatever else you're quoting in its right in its right place. So I would say that what we need to do is we need to be careful that we don't just memorize for the sake of memorization. It is important, but it is just a stage to then move on to thinking deeply about what does revelation mean, what does hadith mean, what does fiqh mean, and to do that we need to really have some strong conversations about what is the purpose of memorization. I mean,
Mm.
would you have a child? Would you prefer to have a child who's just memorized lots of text but doesn't understand a word of it? Or would you prefer to have a child who actually understands what the text is saying, maybe not necessarily has memorized it,
Yeah.
but in net effect they have memorized it because they understand what it means and they embody it. Ideally, you want to have both. In an ideal world, you want them to have memorization and you want them to have a deep understanding of what revelation means and asking those critical questions. So we don't want to fall into the dichotomy of like memorization is one thing and understanding is two separate things. We want to kind of bring them together.
I think the Islamic educational system, as from pre-modern times until now, is supposed to be a system that fulfills the aims of the Islamic education system. So what are the aims? So obviously the ultimate we want to produce the educational system should produce personalities,
Mhm.
shakhsiyat, um, who think from the Islamic worldview, the aqidah of Islam, and they behave according to the sublime, values and qualities and ideas of Islam. So they
Mhm.
think and behave like Muslims. I know it sounds a bit obvious, but I think that so the formation, the takween al-shakhsiyya al-islamiyya is got to be one of the aims of the Islamic education. So people come out thinking like a Muslim, according to their worldview, behaving like a Muslim. So their thoughts and their behaviors is shaped by the creed of Islam. Then I think one of the other aims of the Islamic educational system, and you touched on this a bit, was yes, preservation and transmission of the Islamic culture, the thaqafa Islamiyya. So the study of aqidah, the fiqh, hadith, Arabic, all the ulum al-shari'iyya that we call that relate to our worldview. And then of course seerah and Islamic history. I think the Islamic education system has to preserve that Islamic culture, i.e.
Mhm.
our theology, our law, our ethics, our history, our sciences, and that is the identity, that culture, that thaqafa is like a backbone of our identity as a people, as a ummah. Then I think the Islamic education system has to have some form of empowerment. The education system's got to produce individuals who are scholars. Definitely, we need ulama, fuqaha, but we also need ulama in the sense of scientists. We need professionals
Of course.
who can lead, right? Because you can lead the ummah, politically, intellectually, scientifically on the world stage.
Yes.
That empowerment has got to be there. And finally, and I think you mentioned this, and I think probably that must be the ultimate supreme goal of all Muslims is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The educational system's got to it's got to cultivate in the individual the desire for Allah's pleasure, but at the same time the ability to engage the world, right? So
Yes,
balancing this,
of course.
yeah, this akhirah vision and drive towards that supreme goal, which is Allah's pleasure, but
Yeah,
also the practical worldly skills
yeah,
required to live in the world. So I
absolutely.
think, yeah, so I think the Islamic education system needs those four things.
Absolutely. And when we say the pleasure of God, I mean
Yeah,
it's an ideal. It's not concrete. And so you can acquire the pleasure of God by becoming a political leader, a political
absolutely.
scientist.
Absolutely.
You can do it in many, many fields. But for some reason, I mean, for reasons that we're discussing also,
Mm,
we've said that you can only become successful if you're a certain type of Muslim. But that doesn't make sense historically speaking, and both in light of the Quran
right.
and Sunnah. Um, we see the companions, may God's peace and blessing be upon all of them, and the Tabi'een and the successful generation after all of them, they
Yeah.
all excelled in different fields. Because, like I said right at the beginning, it was a prophet, alayhi salatu, who was unique, right?
Right.
After that, it's like everybody excels in different fields, whether it's hadith, fiqh, military. We need military generals. We need people
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
army. We need people in science. We need different people in different fields. So we see this in early on in Islamic civilization. And you talk about thaqafatul Islamiyya, which is this idea of Islamic culture. We don't really study this stuff anymore. I mean, we don't study culture anymore. There are books written on it. I mean, I was just translating a paper by Maulana Nurul Hassan Kandilwi with Maulana Uwais
Mm,
Baji. We're going to publish inshallah ta'ala.
inshallah.
And it's fascinating, the sort of sciences they were studying, literature, poetry, ethics. They were studying these sciences, and they were ready for civil service. They were ready to go out and make a difference in the world. And even if you look at people like to, go to these popular lectures on Salahuddin Ayyubi, but what needs to be emphasized is not the person himself. What were the cultures? What were the families? What were the funding? What happened generations before him that planted the seeds for this tree to emerge, for this flower to emerge? Right? It doesn't happen immediately. There was a fikr, there was a concern to make the world a better place, to change the story state of the Muslims in Al-Aqsa at the time, and so forth. So what we need to do is we also need to think about systems that we need to set in place, organizations we need to set in place. We don't need to, I mean, I'm going to say this, we don't need to spend 5, 6 billion, 30 million pounds on building mosques. Why can't you put that into a waqf? Why
Mm,
can't our mosques think about awqaf? Can you
yeah,
put
yeah.
1 billion into an awqaf, right? And then, and the sad thing is, I've spoke to a lot of people who don't know what an awqaf is. So we need to go on a whole educational program to say to people, put 10 million pounds into an awqaf, raise money if you can, put that 10 million pounds into an awqaf, into an endowment fund, whether it's investment fund. The money that it generates, from that we'll spend on mental health care needs for our community, will spend on better facilities for our sisters or for people who need it in our community, for our elders, an aging population perhaps, these sort of things. So we really, it's not that we don't have the financial resources, it's just that we haven't strategically thought about these things enough. So thaqafa is very important. Having Muslims who are literate, I don't mean literate in terms of they have
Yeah,
GCSE or
yeah, yeah,
A-levels.
yeah.
I mean literate in the sense of, like, not only did you read the ulum al-shar'iyya, Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, Hadith, but Quran, Hadith, Sunnah, Kalam, all of these things, but they are also reading wider literature. Reading books written by non-Muslims and seeing what kind of conversations they're having in similar fields. What are they having conversations about in terms of theology? What about your topic that you've been talking about, which you wrote about, mashallah, on the problem of evil. I mean, I'm just reading C.S. Lewis, right, the
Mm,
problem of pain, right? Wonderful insights that you can, even if it's written by someone who went back to Christianity, if you like. There's insights in here that we as Muslims, again, critical thinking, right, and reading broadly, that we as Muslims can bring in and say, oh, okay, this agrees with our religion. Um, of course, this all presupposes that the Muslim community also supports and financially supports ulama and our thinkers to do this. We need to think about how we can support our students, our brightest minds, our talented people, to actually to fund them and to go out and study a PhD or to go to a madrasa for 6 years and then do a PhD, and then they come back to our community and benefit us. We're still thinking about bricks and mortar. We're not thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
people. We need to invest in people. I think that's really, really important.
Where do we see the greatest opportunities for revitalizing the Islamic education system so that it can once again produce thought leaders and contribute to the global production of knowledge? Like where do you think that is, where do you think it's exciting, or where do you think it's a bit lukewarm, or what do you think?
Yeah.
Let's have a discussion about
Brilliant. No, brilliant. So this is, I mean, we need to look at the Muslim community. Let's look at Britain, for example,
that.
right?
Okay,
So most of Muslims in Britain are working class Muslims.
right.
So for them, they just need to know whether something is halal or haram. They need spiritual guidance, moral guidance. They don't need some philosopher, theologian coming to their Jummah khutbah and just wowing down with Ibn Arabi and Futuhat. Brilliant, but it's not going to help them. So we need to be realistic. So we need a jama'ah which takes care of everyday Muslim needs. Very important. And Imams and ulama, mashallah, do a sterling job. We have to be honest. We have to be grateful to God, to Allah, that our makatib, our madaris, our darul ulum, for all their ills and their criticisms, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are. I think you can agree with me if it wasn't for them. At the same time, we are critical, of course, but we understand that they play an important role. I'm a big supporter of Darul Ulooms, as you know, and of
Yes,
Madaris. I mean, whatever I can, and our ulama and our alimas, we salute them in terms of the qurbani that they make.
definitely.
And many of them, let's be honest, are paid literally minimum wage, and they do it in addition to their full-time job. So they have a 9 to 5 job. I mean, think about it. They've worked 9 to 5 and then they come home. Some of them I've met who rush straight from one place to another
Yeah,
and teach our children. I mean, they are
definitely.
doing hifzul iman, like literally, right? So we have, and that's a ni'mah. I have people who come from America, for example, or rest of Europe, students, and they are, mashallah, really surprised by some of the organization that we have here. So we really need to support them wherever we can. And those of us who have the ability and the financial needs and the skill set, we should be able to do that. I mean, I do try to go to seminaries and madaris in the evenings, fi sabilillah, and just talk to children, just to inspire the next generation. So that's kind of where we are. But I also think that we need like a small group, not a huge group, who can become our thinkers, as you pointed out. So we don't need every alim or alima to go to university or to have a PhD or to do that sort of intellectual work. What we do need, and I've talked to people about this, is that we should take some of our talented ulama and alimas and say, okay, we're going to fund you. We're going to support you. You're going to go for next 5 to 10 years. We're going to fund you. Whether you do a PhD, whether you go into science, whatever you do, all we ask for is that when you come out of that system, we want you to contribute to society, not just to Muslims. We need to have a broad vision. We need you to go back into British society and to contribute to wider British society and to have an impact and to help people and to be the best scientist, doctor, engineer, sociologist in the field. You want to become that leader, and we need to support them. And because ultimately we benefit as a Muslim community. What does that require? That requires funding, that requires support. Now, we have Muslims in Britain, Alhamdulillah, who have money, who have finances, and who have the ability to support their fellow believers. So, what we should ask is the Muslims who are wealthy, who are setting up these organizations, charities. Why can't our charities, who raise millions annually, give some of that money towards the British Muslim community? We give zakat. Why can't we give something to help our youngsters who gifted youngsters who can then go out and do some important work? And so we really need, it's not that we don't have the money, it's about organization, like I said before, but we also need to get the sort of middle class Muslims who have more money, who have more energy, who have more time to think about these things, to come together and to organize, which is what this organization is that we're part of, and what we're doing is trying to achieve. We're trying to have these conversations and we're trying to support our talented ulama, talented thinkers to say, okay, we'll fund you to do further research. I know so many people, as you will know, who are extremely gifted when they come out of a madrasa system, very,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
gifted. But for one reason or another, because they're not given the support, because the Muslim community is not really investing in a charity community, isn't really spending their money on them, they end up, becoming an Amazon driver. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but what a loss for us as an ummah that we have someone who is given 7 years of their life, who we could nurture for another 7 years, and they could become someone that actually benefits our community.
Are you just saying specifically so madrasa graduates to be given a pathway
Yes,
through funding?
through funding. And this have to be madrasa graduates. Even I mean, I know there's organizations.
Talented Muslim, yeah.
Yeah, like the
Depend-
Avicenna Foundation, Aziz, is it
Yes,
Aziz Foundation? They're doing that, right? They are also doing that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be madrasa institutions. I mean, all they need is tarbiyah. So they just need to be connected, or they just need every now and then to meet mashayikh who can just guide them along on their path. Um, so we just need more of that, who support people on their masters, PhD program, masters programs.
but are you saying they do the whatever engineering, biomedical, whatever it might be, but
Mhm.
what what is it that the net result will be for our community? Is it that they are Islamically, is it that they are students who have an ethical, Islamic ethical and theological consciousness? Is it that they're thinking like a Muslim, feelings, they're thinking like a Muslim, spiritual, but they're in that field. I mean, I'm just wondering,
Yeah,
what is
three
it?
things. Three
Yeah,
things. Number one is for themselves, they
yeah,
will benefit that they will become enriched as a Muslim,
yes,
right?
yes, all right.
So their minds will open. They'll be able to have conversations with people like us who can
Yeah,
help them and nurture them and say, okay, well, this particular, because they're going to have dilemmas, whatever field they go into, ethical, moral dilemmas. So we can say, okay, well, let's think about this deeply. Number one. Number two is they'll become a practical example. They'll excel in those fields. So because for us, ilm is not just ilmi, it's not just intellectual, it's also
yeah,
amali. So
yeah,
then they'll be in those fields and they will infuse it with a Islamic, theological, theocentric, whatever you want to call it, tawheedic
yeah,
paradigm in the
yeah,
field
yeah,
that they go into, whichever field they go into, right? It doesn't matter. We're just happy for them. The third benefit is that they become role models. We know in our Sharia that role modeling is very, very important. I mean, just think about the fiqh around the Imam, right? A'lam, afqah, right? If you
mm,
think about other ulama, they also talk about why, Imam should be good looking and all of these sterling qualities. Why? Because they are like role models. They are sort of people that people can aspire to. So when we have working role models as a community to say, this person, she made it, he made it, why can't you do it now? So they
right,
create a pathway when they get into those fields. The fourth thing, I think, and there was three, but the fourth thing is that as a community, we can uplift ourselves, and we can become part of the conversation in all of these fields, whichever field or whatever subject it is in, of course. Now, of
brilliant.
course, I'm also aware that there is, I mean, as much as we're talking about ideal types and ambition, we have to also be aware that there are forms of structural racism and discrimination.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, there are
We have
systemic.
to be aware of that,
Yeah,
the fact that you're a Muslim, visible Muslim perhaps,
exactly,
or practicing
exactly.
Muslim, that might create barriers for you. But that doesn't mean that we don't strive,
No,
right?
no.
It's not the idea that we don't strive, but those things we can leave with God, we can leave with Allah, but our job is to try and, like to do the best that we can do.
No, I can see how this view. I'm just trying to mentally map it with what I mentioned about my four aims of Islamic education. One of them was the idea of empowerment, right, to prepare Muslims, to be professionals, scientists, engineers, whatever it is, not just scientists, engineers. What I mean is any spectrum where the Ummah can benefit, politically, intellectually, scientifically, technologically, and so on. Right. So I've got one exciting area where Islamic education can be revitalized is empowerment of the believer to get those skills, knowledge, expertise, and that requires funding, right? It requires a funding stream. Okay, brilliant. I like that. I would agree with that. Let's just take a madrasa student as an example. So she
Mhm.
or he has finished their alimiya, and that funding tract is now open for them to be empowered to become a professional, or an academic, whatever it might be. Okay, khair, that's good. But what about the prior bit, like the alimiya bit?
Yeah.
What do we? Is there something we can speak to that
Yeah,
where
of course, of
uh,
course.
you know what might be the opportunities here? What might we need to tweak or?
Yeah.
What's the exciting bit, innovative bit here that we can do?
Brilliant. So first thing, of course, when we talk about madaris or darul ulooms, we
Yeah,
have to first of all acknowledge that they're not homogeneous. They all have,
right, right.
even within one tradition, whether that's a Barelvi tradition, the Deobandi tradition,
Yes, yes,
they within themselves, those of us who are inside those circles know that within themselves they have differences or different values or different points that they put emphasis on. So the ones that are interested, we can work with them, and they are always open. Like the ones that I've met and the ones that I work with, my experience has been overwhelmingly positive. It's a question of resources. It's a question of people like us coming in, giving our time, giving a bit of sacrifice, and trying to help them. What we can do is, first of all, is reflect upon the pedagogy. So the
right.
texts themselves, some of them, not all of them, um, are masterpieces. I mean, the Hidayah, as
Mm,
you know, is a masterpiece. Um, Imam Nasafi's text is a masterpiece. Jalalain, if it's taught well, is a masterpiece. I mean, these books have stood the test of time. So it's not a question that the text or somehow need to be changed. I mean, you can change texts, that's not an issue. The main thing is the students understand what's going on, what was the purpose of that text being written,
right.
developing a malaka to read the text well, so between the lines. This is something that our friends always talk about, being able to read what is the author trying to get at, and then trying to develop within the students the ability to think about, well, what does it mean for us today? What are these conversations that the fuqaha were having in the 10th century or 11th century? What does it mean for us today? Rather than regurgitating what they've said, because that's not the point. The point is, okay, how does it work for us today? How does it work in a society where we've had huge medical advancements in technology, in many fields, right? For ill or for ill or for ill or for good. That requires rijal, Dr. Safaruk. That requires
Mm,
we could say nisa as well, to be fair. That requires investment, I think, in bringing in people who have the time and the energy to do that. It's not easy. I mean, to dedicate yourself to a certain field requires a huge amount of time. You can't do it part time, you have to do it full time. So that requires people like us and financiers and business people and people who really care about all of this to say, okay, well, we'll fund or we'll support people to come in and teach these subjects. And that is happening. There are positive signs. So first of all, they need to have the openness. The seminary or the madrasa needs to have the openness and see that this is actually valuable for their students. The second thing is from the community, we need to support people to go into these places to be able to teach our students, our teachers, so that they can bring these texts to life. And also get students to think deeply about what it means for the world today. The challenge you have is sometimes in these places, and it's not their fault,
yeah.
they live in a little bit of a bubble. So they're not always aware of, okay, what's really going on out there, and how does what we've just read, this mutton that we've read, or this text that
Mm,
we just read, what does it mean for the average person living in the world today? So we need people who live in both worlds to come into the seminaries, people who inhabit both worlds, who are grappling with the challenges of modernity, secular modernity, and bringing that into students. What I've been trying to do with, for example, just to give an example, my friend Mufti
yeah.
Muaz, who you know very well, Mufti Muaz Chatti,
Yes.
he's been, mashallah, he's a Dalum teacher, he's a seminary teacher, he's a Mufti. And he realizes, I hope that he won't take this as an insult. I'm trying to, acknowledge good work here as an example of someone I've seen. He realizes that there's a need in the Muslim community in the ulama circle, and he can't fulfill all those needs himself. So what does he do? He gets people who are experts on subcontinental history, people
Mm,
who know what they're talking about when it comes to Islam and modernity, and he gets them on courses, and he makes them accessible for
mm,
madrasa students or for Muslims to get up to speed with the latest debates and get them to know who is responsible for modernity, who's the like the prophets of modernity, where does the asanid of modernity come from, right? And what are the debates within modernity? So, I mean, that's just an example, but he's doing that in other fields. And I'm sure other people are doing that. Al-Balagh are doing
yeah.
that. I don't want to miss out organization. This is where you get tricky because you miss out
Mm,
names that should be mentioned. But everybody has this fikr. Um, so it's happening. It's happening, and that's a positive note. But I do think that we need to get more and train or fund and support more of our Rijal who are working in fields like you are, mashallah, across the spectrum, across the divide, if you like, into these spaces.
We're talking about specifically the UK, of course, rather than perhaps just globally, but it'd be an indication of what to do globally. So there is that requirement of reskilling or upskilling our folks.
Hmm.
So that needs funding and needs investment. Then you talked about another area that can improve or revitalize Islamic education is the pedagogy. So the teaching methods and strategies. I mean, I agree, definitely the pedagogy has to be looked at. What are the specific techniques being used in the halaqah, in the classroom? You know, what is the curriculum delivery like? How are the shuyukh or the teachers, the muallimun, muallimat, how are they presenting the curriculum to make it understandable, engaging? What's even on the curriculum, right?
Mm.
Is it just a list of matun without, like you said, without making it relevant, and things like that? So definitely pedagogy, and then the applied pedagogy. How are you adapting teaching and planning and assessing for learning and the professional development in the faculties? All that I think is very, that is going to fall under a major part of ensuring that the Islamic, I'm just again trying to map it in my mind. So, for my four things that I just laid out, like the mapping, the delivery of the curriculum, the preservation, the transmission of, the Islamic knowledge and culture, that can only come via robust, sort of a robust method of education, so the pedagogy and things like that. So yeah, I would
That comes
agree.
from,
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm saying, Dr. Safaruk, is that people who've been exposed to, it's really sad that we still have to talk about this divide between both worlds, right?
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
still at a
yeah.
stage where we're talking about both worlds. I
Shouldn't
mean, when
be.
you read our ulama carefully, I mean, in fiqh, you find the natural sciences.
Yes.
And when they talk about water, when they become najasa, it's like this is how they understood the world and what makes it najasa, the whole thing about 10 by 10.
Yeah, yeah.
That's just natural observation. You're just observing. Does that mean that we have to do it that way? No. We now have theories that can help us understand things better. So what we really need is that we need we need people who transcend these binaries or these fields that are just divided, and they can go into madrasa settings and help them. But also people from the madrasa setting can leave, not leave, but kind of take time out and go into other settings and learn other sciences.
But don't a lot of the madrasas, they have Arabic, Urdu, whatever, Farsi, but they have all the Islamic sciences like Aqidah, Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, Sirah, Islamic history, and they also have empirical sciences and skills, right? Don't a lot of madrasa just have it as part of the curriculum, or
I mean, they teach at
maths,
GCSE
physics?
level,
All
right?
right,
Yeah,
okay.
they'll teach at GCS level, maybe as an A level, but in terms of like doing some takhassus,
Mm.
going into some, doing a physics degree or a degree in
Right, okay.
like economics. I have a degree in economics.
You're doing
Fundamentally
finance, yeah.
changed the way I think about muamalat. I mean, muamalat is very, very important to understand. And you have people like Mufti Faraz, mashallah, and people like that who are doing amazing work in that field as a madrasa graduate, someone who's very gifted and very, very talented, among others. Um, but when I did my degree in economics, it helped me so much because I got to understand not only the capitalist ribawi system, interest-based system, but I also got to understand futures, options, how the system works. I also got to understand the politics and the perils of these systems. I understood how monetary policy works, how fiscal policy works, how these systems are deeply embedded with military industrial complex, all this other stuff. You
Mm.
get to read it, you get to see a really, a really huge system, and then you're trying as a Muslim to work out, okay, where do we go from here? And then how does it help people? When people come to you, Dr. Safaruk, for like issues around, can I get a house or mortgage?
Mm. Mm.
And they're living just below the poverty line, right? And they have issues with, their in-laws,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and or what are you going to say to them? Just carry on, just suck it up,
Yeah.
like how. So this is when religion really becomes alive, because you have to then give them solutions and try and help them. Otherwise, if people just see it as a sort of dead tradition, it doesn't speak to their concerns.
But it's funny when the British came in the subcontinent. they in a way they destroyed the Iftar institution, um, because they wanted to make the application of law so procedural. Whereas Iftar was the way the ulama did it was, real issues were being addressed through the fatwa
Yes,
production. And once you take that away, once you take ulama out of that role, you no longer see Islam as that kind of vital, sort of solution providing,
yeah,
deen, as it were, isn't it? Because you're now trying to the colonial apparatus is now trying to force a kind of a law from above, but it's stripping the role of the ulama and the mufti out of this role. So Islam no longer becomes a living, vital. The interaction between Islamic law and the individual is no longer a vital, dynamic thing. Can you see? So
yeah.
it's interesting that I'll just remember that point based on the point you mentioned, that to take that out now, that relevance, you lose the connection, isn't it, with Islam?
Yes, yes, of course.
You can't
I think
see it.
important. And we just to I think it's Brandon Ingram. He has a page or two where he talks
Mm,
about the project of the Hidayah being translated for colonial purposes.
that's
I mean,
right.
there
That's
was a
right.
background to why that happened,
Of
because
course.
Britain was going through this. I think it was a positivistic sort of worldview, where they wanted law to become like they didn't want it to be abstract. They wanted it to be sort of
Definitely.
this is what was happening. And they struggled with the fact that the qadi was kind of looking at a mas'ala or a situation, and he was kind of thinking about it was complex reasoning that he was doing, and he was like, okay, well, this is the normative fiqh, but for you guys, this is how it works. And the British had problems with that. They were like,
Yeah,
no, we
yeah.
need to have these sort of structures, and we've kind of imbibed that in a way. We sort of carried on with that. Um, Whereas the fatwa, the genre actually dealt with people's real life concerns. And a lot of Muslims are not aware of this history, of how pragmatic and how practical. If you read the Kitab al-Hiyal, mashallah, right? I know it gets a bad name, but if you read it carefully, it's a masterpiece in terms of how to help people in terms of their own situation. So I think um, we've lost that a little bit, Dr. Safaruk, and we've also lost
Right.
reading these texts through a humanistic. I don't want to get into this conversation right now, but it is important. When I teach fiqh, for example, my students will tell you that we don't just do reasoning and how the Hanafi mazhab wants to maintain internal coherence in terms
Mm,
of his masail, but we also ask questions like, why did Imam Abu Hanifa take this position? Why did Imam Abu Yusuf take this position? And what really comes out of it was a very humanistic tradition. They were trying to get the students to think about, okay, while we're doing all of this complex reasoning and thinking, it's also about human beings here. We're dealing with people and we want to really help them. And you see that throughout the fiqh happening. You see glimpses of it appearing between the texts where the fuqaha are very pragmatic. And we sometimes don't read it that way. And I think that's missing as well.
because it's important, the way a text is then taken by a particular administration or something like that, and
Mhm.
it's stripped of its commentary tradition. It's tried to be forced into its, like you mentioned, forced into the way English common law was operating, right? And it just didn't work like that,
Mm.
because the matan wasn't written in that way. Uh, we know that the translation was a British colonial. It had the colonial overtones because they wanted the colonially installed judges to adjudicate in the name of Sharia, um, and by taking out the qadis and the muftis, isn't it? We know what that purpose was. But
Mm.
it's just the reason why I mentioned it was we can fall into a pitfall in revitalizing Islamic education. We might make the same mistakes that were done historically, and we don't want to do that with our curriculum, right? We want to make sure that our tradition, the texts are left, with their integrity, but it's how what we want to do with the texts,
Yeah,
that is important. But I just want
exactly.
to, yeah, sorry, man, go on.
Just one thing, Dr. Safaruk. I mean, we have to be careful that we don't start becoming very textualist. I mean, textualist
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah,
a whole
yeah. I was going
conversation
to say,
about, we become like very textual. But remember, I mean, in my book, inshallah, one day it will see the light of day.
inshallah, yeah.
In my book, I say that texts are silent. Texts don't speak. right? They speak through the teacher. So the teacher is the interface through which Imam Marghinani or Imam Quduri or
Yes,
whoever it
yes.
may be, their teacher is the interface which those texts become alive. They're given flesh, if you like.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Yeah.
That's they embody it, right? This is what I
Yeah.
meant about the colonial
Yes.
control and
Yes.
legal authority, isn't it? The
That's right.
British essentially, just took that role of the ulama out from Al Hidayah
Mm-hmm.
and says, no, we're just going to implement this, and so the courts replaced the ulama effectively, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is part of the solution. We need to bring
Yeah,
that back.
we've got some points about how education can be revitalized. Islamic education can be revitalized for the aims that we want. Is one, we need to skill our kids, our individuals. Whether that tract is empirical tract after they finish madrasa, whatever that empirical tract looks like, science, industry, technology, but we need the funds to upskill them.
Hmm.
And then the second thing we mentioned is about this having a new, not new, but a kind of innovative, robust pedagogy that isn't a break from our tradition, keeps the text, you know, but not be textualist. But we don't live in the world of the book because it was written centuries ago, but it's the application of the book in a relevant way, which requires the shuyukh, the right types of individuals. And that might mean, well, I don't know what you think, might mean training teachers. I don't know. I've got this thing. Sometimes I come across people is, why does a teacher need to be trained or a sheikh need to be trained? You're a teacher, anyone goes through teacher training, right? Has to
Yeah.
do teacher training,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
A
Yep.
year long, how to teach, what is the latest theory, what are the best practices, and etc.
So
etc. But I
teaching
don't
is
know
a
why
craft.
people
It's a
they
fun.
think that why should
It's a fun.
ulama be taught,
No, no, no,
have
no.
training in that. I
I
just find it
agree
odd.
with you. I mean, you might know things really well, but
Yeah,
can you teach it?
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
make
It's
it
a different thing,
accessible to
isn't it?
students, right? Otherwise, the danger is that if you don't know how to teach, you actually discourage people from that science. You actually do harm to the science. So I know people who don't like a certain science, not because it's hard, it's just that they had a bad experience because of the teacher who taught it.
Right,
I've,
right.
I've met people like this. When I interrogate them, it's because the person who taught it them either couldn't teach it really well or didn't even know the subject really well. Um, and so what happens is that the students, because smart students pick it out, they can tell when a teacher doesn't know what he's talking
Yeah.
about. Um, so you also need to it's a skill, it's a craft to be able to take something very, very complex and sort of speak to it in a way that people can understand it. So you're absolutely right. It's a craft, and knowing your audience at their different levels is also part of being able to speak to people. I mean, this is part of our tradition, being able to speak to people according to their level. Just one more thing, about you know, 6 years clearly isn't enough to make someone a scholar, right? I mean, we can have a conversation about what makes a scholar,
Mm,
but if you think about a Muslim community and their needs, what I said earlier about, that most needs are day to day, everyday needs. How do I do this? How can this work for me? Is halal or haram? Can I do this? What's the masala on this? So we do need a lot of religious leaders in the sense that they can answer everyday Muslim questions. So what they can do, we can create a pedagogy for them where they don't have to spend 6 years in a madrasa. They can spend 3 to 4 years. So they can do basic Quran tafsir. Maybe they'll know Arabic. Maybe they'll know another language. They'll know enough of religion to know where to go to if people ask them a question. And then what we do is we say, okay, anyone who's done this 4 year course, if you want to study further or you want to take a break and come back, you can do this specialist course for another 5, 6 years, which will be fully funded, but only for people who have the ability to do it. They'll become the scholars. They'll become the people that the community will go to, or the ulama. They'll become the ulama in terms of like they have a deep understanding of these sciences. Maybe we'll fund them to do a PhD on top, or something like this. So what we happens is we tier it out. We have a tier that's
mm.
kind of like serving the Muslim community, which is an important need. Anybody that wants to go further, whether straight away or a few years later, they can do that. But that creates the specialists, which is also a need. But that's not like for everybody to do. The problem at the moment is it's neither here or neither there. Everybody's doing it, but we don't really know like who's a specialist in these fields.
No, definitely, I agree. I want to thread some of the things that you mentioned, and then in a kind of coherent kind of vision or call to action. I don't know what we can call it, a kind of roadmap.
Gee.
And I'm thinking it look something like this. Let me know what you if
Yeah.
if this sort of resonates with what you've just been saying, because I think it's important. A lot of the things that you mentioned. So obviously, restoring any Islamic education system, let's call it, must begin with some kind of vision. You've got to know what you're doing and a kind of structure. And then at the core, we need to reclaim the aim of this education as being individuals who are ultimately seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're becoming the shakhsiyat, these individuals whose hearts and minds are for seeking Allah's pleasure, but at the same time, they're engaging constructively in the world. So I mean, we were very clear about that. Alhamdulillah, that was beautiful. So that practically, how does that kind of spill out? You mentioned about making sure that there's funding streams to upskill our people for the relevant fields or areas, whether that's science, engineering, technology, whatever it might be. But of course, those individuals, are based on the an Islamic worldview because they've come out from the madrasa, they've learned Arabic, they've learned fiqh, they've been taught hadith, they've been taught all the Islamic sciences as well, and that should inform the way they are when they go into these new empirical fields. We mentioned about pedagogy. One of the aspects of having an a revitalized Islamic education system is the pedagogy. The thought behind and the method behind teaching the Islamic curriculum and delivering it. Um, and then that is got to be in relation to the divine purpose of why we're here and ethical responsibility and things like that. And then you mentioned, Marana, that communities must be invested in this as well. That everyone's got to come together on this and invest um, in this sort of training or skilling or education of an individual. And that makes everyone in the community a part of that educational sort of infrastructure. We mentioned about the need for having teachers also being trained, or ulama, scholars also being trained to be able to teach competently. And we need individuals, not just individuals, but we need orgs and centers of learning that are dynamic, interdisciplinary. I can't remember if you mentioned that,
Hmm.
but they're connected to the needs of modern society.
Yeah.
So yeah, so above all, I guess we as an ummah, as a community, we've got to collectively get these structures in place and have our own confidence in our own deen and our own civilization
Mm,
as well, and not to come from a weak position.
of course.
I don't know. I want to help me wrap this up, and inshallah, we can.
No,
Uh,
what I would say is that, look, it's a positive space. I'm infused when I get students coming to me from madrasa backgrounds or university backgrounds or other backgrounds who say to me, who are trying to bring all these different sciences together. It's a very interesting conversation. I love listening to people like that. So you get madrasa graduates who are now doing, who are in universities or doing other things, who are trying to merge these different worlds together. Some do it intellectually, some do it practically. Then you have university students, mashallah, who are very gifted, whether it's in the hard sciences, your physics, your mathematics, your biology, chemistry, which are all important. And then they're thinking about, okay, well, what does that mean for conversations around, theology and philosophy?
mm,
I mean, some of my students who study mantiq with me, for example, are not ulama, but they go to university and they understand mantiq. It makes perfect sense to them. They get it. They have some really interesting conversations. We need to encourage that type of intellectual foray in our communities, while at the same time making sure that in whatever way possible, they're also giving back to society at large, not just the Muslim society, of course, which is important, but also to wider British society. How are they contributing to wider society as well? So we want more Muslims to be in these spaces. But we should never neglect the needs of our primary constituency, which I think is really important, um, which is the working class Muslim community, who really, we should be taking care of. And those of us who are privileged, or those of us who have access to these spaces, should never forget that we also have a duty of care towards them when it comes to education and providing for their needs. Because together, if we uplift them, we all benefit uh, in 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 all of this. And we should be brave, we should have some sort of shuja'ah when it comes to ilm. We shouldn't be afraid. Bastatan fil ilmi wal jism, right? We should, whatever comes our way, we'll study it carefully, we'll read it carefully, we'll engage it with it carefully, we'll be fair to it. And this is like, whichever paradigm you want to take, whether it's a Ghazalian paradigm, Ibn Arabi paradigm, Shah Waliullah paradigm, Ibn Taymiyyah paradigm, whichever paradigm you really want to take, you'll see that they were doing this. They were engaging with the questions of their time in a thorough manner.
Brilliant. Uh, I mean, I had a lovely conversation with my teacher, Maulana Harun. It's been brilliant. I want to invite you all to think about what's been said today, and continue the conversations. This dialogue isn't about settling the dispute, the many conversations that are going on. There are many going on. This is a little discussion to get our own thoughts on this issue, to try and tease out some of Moulana Harun's thoughts on these issues. He's worked in this area for years. He's writing and has written a lot. I invite you all to take this conversation, contribute with your own views, get into contact with Dialogue Within Islam, DW Islam, and help make these conversations. And the more we get these dialogues going, the more we can understand the different voices here. Uh, and all voices are welcome and important. And we want to make sure that we get all voices engaged as much as we can. I really want to thank you all for your support with DW Islam. We hope your support continues, and it will, inshallah. We hope you're benefiting from what's being offered, and we hope to tap in with you in our next session. And I thank you all for joining. Assalamu alaikum